Hello, and welcome to the Designing with Love podcast. I am your host, Jackie Pellegrin, where my goal is to bring you information, tips, and tricks as an instructional designer. Hello, GCU students and alumni. Welcome to episode 23 of the Designing with Love podcast. In this episode, I will compare the differences between formative and summative assessments when designing and delivering learning experiences. First, I will begin by describing the nuts and bolts of formative assessments, provide 3 examples of how you can utilize formative assessments, and how you can effectively track them. Then I will describe the nuts and bolts of summative assessments, provide 3 examples of how you can utilize summative assessments, and how you can effectively track them as well. Before we dive into formative assessments, let's take a few moments to understand what a formative assessment is in education and training. One of the best ways to describe formative assessments is they are evaluations of someone's learning progress in a classroom or training environment. Some common formative assessments can include quizzes, games, projects, presentations, and group activities. However, as education and technology continues to evolve, the types of formative assessments can expand. If you have any other ideas for formative assessments that you may have used before, feel free to send me a text message here in the podcast. So, now that we know what a formative assessment is and some common types that can be utilized with learners, let's review what makes formative assessments a great way to assess your learners. First, formative assessments work well when they are used on a regular basis. You can incorporate formative assessments based on a calendar system or with a set of lessons or modules. Second, formative assessments are more flexible than summative assessments, which makes them an ideal choice to assess where your learners are at with their progress. For example, you don't always need to use a traditional method such as a piece of paper and pencil to gauge your learner's progress. Other options can include in-class games, group presentations, and hands-on activities. If you are delivering a class or session in an online format, you can incorporate online formative assessment tools such as Kahoot and group presentation software tools such as Canva to assess your learners. Third, formative assessments are a great way to keep your learners engaged in your class or session. For example, you can have a varied routine in how you assess your learners with each lesson or module. Then, at the end of a course or training session, you can look for patterns among different class sections or sessions. Now that we have reviewed some of the nuts and bolts of formative assessments, I will share 3 types of formative assessments you can try with your learners in your course or training session. These examples are from Brad Hummel, an educator and writer who works to help teachers empower their students. The first example, which is actually one of my favorites, is to have your learners make an advertisement for a concept they have just learned. The advertisement can include visuals and text to help sell the idea. This type of assessment makes learners apply what they have learned into a creative exercise, which is key for long-term retention. The reason I love this type of example is because my background is in marketing with my undergraduate degree, and I also love doing creative type of projects. So this is right up my alley, and I'm sure that a lot of your students and learners would love it as well. The second example is to instruct your learners to lay out the main ideas of a new concept they learned and then compare the concept to another to see where they agree or disagree. This exercise makes learners apply previous knowledge to a new format so they can recall it better in the future when needed. So think of some ways that you can do the idea comparisons. That's really a great option as well. The third example is to introduce a popular misconception to your learners after teaching a specific concept. Then have your learners discuss why the misconception is false and where it may have started. This type of exercise makes learners think critically about what they have just learned, while also showing them how to debunk misinformation with their peers in a constructive manner. So this would be great for like a group project, doing this type of activity. I can see that working really well in a classroom or training session. If you have any other examples for formative assessments you would like to share, you can text me here in the podcast. All right, so now let's take a look at 3 different ways we can track formative assessments with our learners. Depending on the level of your learners, you can adjust these tracking mechanisms accordingly to fit the class or training session. First, you can track the assessments by a grade or score. This provides you with a specific concentrated view of how a learner or set of learners effectively learns information. Just keep in mind that graded assessments are a source of stress for many learners. So you'll want to make sure that when you design your lesson or module, that you keep that in mind, especially if you want to make it fun or loose. That's something to always consider. Second, you can track the assessments by feel based on your instincts as a teacher or trainer. This allows you to select which learners need additional support based on your observations. However, one of the downsides to this type of approach is that you can't really show this information to your administrators or leadership. So this can be difficult when there are specific standards or outcomes that need to be met. And especially for my students that are in K-12 education, you might find this a little bit harder to do. But if you're doing something maybe at the beginning of your lesson that doesn't require standard assessment, or anything in a training session that doesn't require that outcome type of information, feel free to try this out. And text me too, let me know if you've done something like that. Third, you can track formative assessments with learner data. This type of non-graded information may reflect how your learners are doing, such as questions they have frequently answered incorrectly or subject areas where they are struggling. Hopefully, your district or organization has a comprehensive data management system in place, which makes tracking learner data the most effective way to measure progress. So if you find that you want to do this tracking and have a mechanism in place, I would suggest checking with your district or your organization to see what they have available. Now that we have covered formative assessments, let's take a few moments to understand what a summative assessment is in education and training. One of the best ways to distinguish summative assessments is they are evaluations of what someone has learned throughout a course or training session. So unlike formative assessments where you're looking at that snapshot in time and you're seeing where your learners are at a specific point, think of summative assessments as you're taking a step back and you're looking at the whole of a course or a session, and you're getting that 10,000-foot overview. That's the best way to distinguish those two. Some common summative assessments can include tests, final exams, reports, essays or papers, or end-of-class projects. However, as different forms of technology such as artificial intelligence become common for learners to utilize in classwork and training, it is important to incorporate authentic assessments to help challenge critical thinking and authenticity in the assessments. It is important to note that summative assessments almost always occur at the end of a course or training session, unless the teacher or an instructor decides to break a course or session into manageable chunks, such as microlearning lessons or modules. Summative assessments are often cumulative because they are meant to evaluate a learner's long-term retention of information. So keep that in mind as you're building summative assessments. When evaluating your learners through a formative assessment, this forces your learners to seriously reflect and think critically about the information they have learned over the course of time, and to bring together the information in a cohesive manner. This can also be a helpful way to ensure your learners retain essential information from one course or training session to another. Therefore, if you teach an introductory course or session, summative assessments are a great way to set your learners up for success in the next course or training session. Now that we have reviewed some of the nuts and bolts of summative assessments, let's take a look at some summative assessment examples that you can utilize in your course or training session. These examples are also from Brad Hummel. First, you can include an in-depth report where learners choose a topic that resonated with them in the class or session and submit a report. These reports often showcase a learner's interest, and you can evaluate their engagement level in the class or session by how they approach the report. Second, you can have your learners select a project to complete that reflects what they have learned throughout the course or session. This gives your learners some autonomy and choice in what they want to do. So that can be a great way to give your students that ability to have that autonomy. And so I think that's a great way to do that. Third, you can do a personal evaluation paper that requires learners to apply principles from the class or session to their personal lives. This is a great way for learners to evaluate themselves through a different lens while exploring the nuances of different principles they have learned in a class or session. If you have any other examples of summative assessments you would like to share, you can text me here in the podcast. Now, let's take a look at a couple of different ways we can track summative assessments with our learners. Again, depending on the level of your learners, you can adjust these tracking mechanisms accordingly to fit the class or training session. One way to track formative assessments is through a presentation, which evaluates the learner's soft skills and public speaking abilities. If you are teaching an online course or training session, you can have the learners present their ideas in a synchronous format live or through an asynchronous format by recording their presentation. Another way to track formative assessments is through written exams or project-based assessments, which are an ideal way to see a learner's full scope of how they understand your class or session. In his blog post, Brad shares that whatever you choose, it is important to stick with a consistent grading scale so that you can identify your own strengths and weaknesses in the classroom as learners complete your course or training session. As we wrap up this podcast episode, you may be wondering, what is more important, formative or summative assessments? As Brad points out in his blog post, many new teachers and instructors have this question. He mentions that in a perfect world, they are equally important because formative assessments allow learners to showcase that they are learning the content, and summative assessments let them show what they have learned. So it's like that show and tell in a sense. However, public education values summative assessments compared to formative assessments due to standardized tests. So those of you that teach, you know this very well. However, it can still be beneficial to incorporate both types of assessments when they are implemented properly. So feel free to do some research on that and how you can incorporate both the formative and the summative in that aspect. I hope you have found this information about formative and summative assessments helpful as you design effective learning experiences while completing your master's program in instructional design and beyond, maybe even when you go into your first instructional design job or a similar type of role. Here's a quote from Carol Ann Tomlinson, an educational author, about the importance of assessments that I wanted to share with you. Assessment is today's means of modifying tomorrow's instruction. Thank you for taking some time to listen to this podcast episode today. Please take a moment to like the episode and share it with others so they can learn about this topic as well. Have a great day.